how interesting and actually how seriously do I take the Daily Objective? Seriously enough to watch a 3-hour movie for a second time last night, just so today I would have interesting things to say to you. So this 3-hour movie was Oppenheimer, and I'm here today with Joseph to discuss it. So you might know Joseph. He's been on the show in the past. He's working with Lisa Van Dam on the Read With Me project, which I recommend it, particularly for those of you who want to dive into works of literature that look intimidating, perhaps not as intimidating as a 3-hour movie. So, Joseph, here's the big picture for me when it comes to Nolan movies. I adore Nolan. I used to think that Nolan should be the director to direct Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. If one guy could do it, I used to think that would be Nolan. I'm not sure if I think the same thing after watching Oppenheimer, but we'll get there.
Interesting. Okay.
I had my strongest aesthetic experience ever and the strongest reaction ever when it comes to art when I watched Interstellar in the cinema. It's something which is going to be unforgettable for me. And this was my mindset when I watched Oppenheimer for the first time back in London some months ago. Because in Greece, it only came yesterday. Having said that, when I watched Oppenheimer, it was a letdown. Cinematically, I found it obviously great. How can a Nolan movie not be cinematically great? But I found it as a huge missed opportunity because you had all the elements of a great epic, an epic figure like Oppenheimer himself, larger than life, an epic project, create a bomb that will win us the war. And yet all this is lost in a sea of, in an ocean of 3 hours of a plot that no one is sure what exactly is happening. Why do we see the sea that we think? We jump back and forth to different timelines. And most important for all of these things, I think this is a movie without a moral compass. This is a movie where the director is not really sure who is a good guy, who is a bad guy. And at the end, he throws everything in a gray scale, like, well, who is to know who is good and who is bad? So what's your take on the movie?
Interesting. So I guess for some context, I read leading up to the movie, I read about half the book. So the movie, for anyone that doesn't know, is based off of a book called, I think, American Prometheus, and it's the story of Oppenheimer. I read it because I was very interested. I love Nolan like you do, and I wanted to kind of immerse myself in the story because I knew nothing about Oppenheimer before. And I was very disappointed in the book, and so my expectations of the movie were quite low. And so I thought the movie did a much better job of the elements of the book than the book did. So it exceeded my expectations. I actually enjoyed the movie more, I think, because I had read the book as a background. And I guess I wasn't as surprised by some of the things that came out in the movie because I knew it was based off of this book. So the book focuses a lot on Oppenheimer's relationship to communism. That is the dominant thread in the book. It doesn't give you the impression of the scope or the magnitude of the Manhattan Project, which is a very big letdown in the book. You don't really get to understand the nuance and the scale of what they were doing and what they were going to achieve. Most of it's focusing on who was a spy, who had Russian ties. That dominated the conversation. And so I thought the movie already did a much better job of that, right? You got, like, a lot of the focus was on the Manhattan Project, and you got to really appreciate the scale of what they were doing. I loved the scene when they had the marbles to demonstrate the difficulty of getting the uranium and plutonium. In the book, they kind of gloss over, they mention it's a very hard project, but they don't really give you an understanding of why it's so challenging, why it's so difficult, why it requires so much industrial effort. And even that one visual, I thought, gives you a really, each piece of uranium is this little marble, right? And look how much we have to fill. So the movie already did a great job there. And I guess I had some context of the communist focus, which is why maybe the flashbacks made more sense to me, like the back and forth between Robert Downey Jr. and the past and the future, why that tied. And the book does not do it in a compelling way. And so I thought the movie just presented that in a much more interesting way to learn about. The last thing I'll say is about just on the moral tone. One thing I actually quite liked about the book and the movie is they do dive into at least the questions, right? The moral question of the bomb and dropping it, and entertain that and look at the whole context. And I think that is actually important for objectivists, because in objectivism, we tend to say, if you're not the aggressor, you can do whatever you want and, drop the bomb if it's going to save lives, which I still agree with from a moral position. But it doesn't mean you don't take a step back to think about it and think about something like that very carefully. And so I thought the book, and even in the movie a little bit, did a good job of at least looking at some of the ideas that the scientists had, right? The concerns they had, and the magnitude of this question. It's not, it's not an easy decision to make, despite it maybe still being the moral one. And I thought, I love that scene where he's giving the speech after, and essentially it's like the bomb goes off in the audience, and it really makes clear how much it's weighing on you, or weighing on him, I should say. So those are kind of my initial thoughts.
We'll get back to this scene, because second time I watched the movie, I appreciated this scene much more. So there's going to be only mild spoilers, but let me say this to the audience. So first time I watched the movie, I hadn't done any research. I thought I have a fairly good take on the historical reality of the 30s and the 40s, and then the beginning of the Cold War. And I couldn't follow most of the movie, to be honest with you. I watched it without subtitles, and it was difficult to follow the dialogue anyway. Yesterday I was in Greece, obviously there was subtitles. So I would say, before you go watch the movie, at least do the basic background, that for example, things about the Red Decade, about the 1930s, the sympathy of many scientists towards communism, the various fronts that the Communist Party had. Then about the shock in the American society in the late 40s, when they realized that the Soviet Union also had the bomb. And then there was the question, how did they get the bomb? So without all this historical knowledge, more than half of the movie, almost half of the movie, you're like, what is happening here? Who is this guy? Why am I watching this? So Nolan has this thing that, my movies is like, you should be way too clever to understand them. I think in Oppenheimer, he's overdoing it, because it's not only you have to be too clever to follow it, you have to hold like a PhD in history to follow it. I mean, let's be honest. How many people knew about Strauss and these specifics? Now, so that the people can follow. The movie is basically 3 parts. The first part, and throughout these 3 parts, they play with 3 different timelines, so try not to get confused here. The first part is the coming of age, let's say, of the great mind that is Oppenheimer. We follow him from being an eccentric student to being the guy who is considered one of the best minds in America. For me, this is the best part. Then we get to the Manhattan Project, which I think it could be more epic. It's almost some of the gravitas that you'd expect is missing, but we're compensated with one of the strongest, I think, scenes that I've ever watched in cinema, which is the countdown to the bomb. Not the actual bomb. We never see the bombs falling in Japan, but the Trinity test, the test bomb.
Yes.
These 5 minutes before the bomb, the countdown, even the second time I watched it, I was grabbing my seat like that. And the reason is not only the great acting, we're going to talk about the acting, is also that this film has an extra actor, and this is the sound. The sound is so immersed, integrated in the plot, that it's like a character of its own. So again, cinematically, you're going to be compensated for the 3 hours. And then we have the Trinity test, and then you expect, okay, that was the peak. And then you have almost another hour of a film, which again, for most people, is like, what am I watching now and why am I watching it? Which is Oppenheimer's post-war troubles. Not troubles with the law, but troubles with the scientific bureaucracy, and it has to do with his past communist sympathies. So one thing again, to praise Nolan. Do you remember, Joseph, a film some years ago called The Imitation Game, which was about Alan Turing? Now, if you think about it, this was a film with a similar theme. A scientist trying to do something great. And it was a nice film. But it's a film that after a couple of days, you forget it. But Oppenheimer, I mean, you might love it, you might not like it, you won't forget it. So what Nolan did is, it's not easy to create such an cinematic epic around this story. And you mentioned that scene with the doubt. So indeed, the movie asks the right questions, but it doesn't give you any tool to provide the answers. So, for example, did we have to drop the bomb to Japan? Yesterday, I did a whole podcast with Ben Bayer in ARCUK channel. The movie doesn't even give you a clue. Were the Japanese good guys? Were they bad? Was it a war of aggression, a war of defense? Now, maybe you could say this was not the movie's job. But without knowing anything about what was happening with the Japanese, how can we sympathize or not sympathize with Oppenheimer? So I think the movie leaves us to dry, as they say. So don't you think there should be a bit more moral clarity, or at least an attempt towards moral clarity?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think you make a good point, and it's hard for me to evaluate because I read the book before. So I know it's hard for me to separate the context I had going into it. So it's nice to hear your perspective because you saw it once with only any incidental knowledge you had about that historical period, right? And in the book, they do go into more detail. You know, they look at some of the evidence in terms of, okay, was Japan about to surrender? What were the terms of the surrender? They were like, how close were we to victory already? So they go into that a little bit more in the book, but you're right. I don't remember them giving enough details in the movie. So, you know, whether or not they need to present that Japan's the aggressor, I think maybe that's sufficient, like enough in the cultural knowledge not to need to mention that part. But you're right, they probably left out too many details to equip you to make any sort of moral conclusion based off of what's shown in the movie.
And at the same time, so you mentioned they leave out important information. We're bombarded with stuff that I still don't know why I watched it. Like, I have no idea why I watched so much of Oppenheimer's affair with that woman. Like, I still don't know. Okay, she was a communist. I have no idea why he fell in love with her, why then he left her, why he switched to this other woman who I'm supposed to think she was a great character. I understand we live in 2023. There needs to be a strong female presence on screen. If someone can explain to me why Oppenheimer's wife is such a great addition compared to the film time she gets. Like, first time we see her, she's a mother who is drunk. Then she's just telling him, hey, you have to stand up. You shouldn't let people ruin your name. Like, there's no depth there. So there's too much. The film is stretched thin, and I don't know, why do I have to care about these? Why do I have to care about these characters? So why is it important, for example, that Oppenheimer had this discussion with this guy who basically told him, oh, our friends the Soviets, if you have any secrets to give them, let me know. There's a whole context behind this, that actually the Soviets had not one, but 3 spies in the Alamo project, in Los Alamos, and they also tried to get to Oppenheimer unsuccessfully. So Oppenheimer was not a Soviet spy. Go watch last Friday's TDO that I did on Soviet infiltration. But all this, I can only understand them after having spent hours and hours of doing my own research. The film bombards with all that stuff. And you wonder, what am I seeing there? At the end, we see there was another woman with whom he had an affair. Like, again, why? Okay, he was a womanizer, but it's too much, and I can't process them. And also, I cannot sympathize or connect to them. I mean, I connect to Oppenheimer because I already knew him as a figure. Cillian Murphy, I think he has a performance for the ages. But beyond that, like, why should I make me get a bit more invested in what I'm seeing would be my complaint to Nolan.
I think one thing I liked about that, because I didn't have as strong of a negative reaction about some of those scenes, and I think it helped tease out the nuance of his character a little bit. So my impression by the end of it is here's this really intelligent person, very driven person, right? He's going to help America get this atomic bomb first. They believe the Nazis are going to get it first, and if they do, that's really bad. That's really, really bad. And so he's motivated, he's driven, and he's got all these conflicting political views, right? He's clearly patriotic towards America. He's naive about communism. I would be interested to talk to you about that a little bit more too, why they were so captivated by communism and socialism. But and he's got this really complicated relationship with women that's bizarre and extreme and intense, and he's juggling, you see the insane pressure he's under, right? He has to juggle doing this amazing achievement while also having these ties to people that would undermine his ability to work on the project, and be loyal to America. So all of that together, and for me, a very powerful scene in the movie was when, this is going to be a big spoiler for anyone, but when the person he was having an affair with commits suicide, and he finds out, and he has this very emotional moment, where you just see, like, in the middle of the Manhattan Project, this thing happens, and it bubbles up. And so you get to tease that out. I don't think that scene's as powerful without the rest of the context. And then on top of that, I think for the wife, she has some great moments later on where she's the only one with a backbone who's standing up to the assault on his legacy. And I think the fact that you see how troubled she is before that adds to that impact later on. So I think all these things together, I agree with you. It's a lot going on. And, maybe if you hadn't read the book beforehand, it would be too much. So I was already familiar with a lot of these scenes because they took them right out of the book. So to me, it was like just interesting to see them played out. So that's my defense of it.
I'll tell you one thing, defense. Joseph. Now that you said all this, I'm serious. I get it. But the fact that I had to watch the film twice and then have a discussion with you to get it, again, we go back to, like, Nolan makes us try way, way, way too hard, I think, to get all this.
In this movie, though, I don't think that's typical of Nolan, though. Well, I don't think in his other movies, I've never had to work hard to.
Maybe I'm not the most clever person under the sun, but I watched Inception with a friend who had watched it 8 times.
Sure.
And he had to,
Inception
every 5 minutes, I would pause and say, what happened here? What
Sure.
Anyway,
what was the other one? Inception, and the other one, Tenet. Yeah, those ones are a little bit more out there. But The Dark Knight and Interstellar, those are pretty accessible.
Yeah, Interstellar was great. The Dark Knight, I mean, from all the from all the Batman movies, The Dark Knight is the one that I found least impressing. I know it's sacrilege, but I don't think Heath Ledger was the best Joker. Sorry, people. But again, it has this ending that no matter how many times I see it, I always get like the goosebumps. So I think the ending of Dark Knight makes it a brilliant movie only by itself. So in the last few minutes, let's us discuss what you said. So what drove Oppenheimer close to communism? So it's the late 30s. So one big thing in the world is the rise of Nazism. We still don't know that much about the crimes of Stalin. So Soviet Union is, or at least people who don't want to know, don't know, because they believe the BS that, all these people we executed were basically traitors and stuff. And most importantly, we have the Spanish Civil War. So we have fascists rising up in Spain against the democratic government. And soon this becomes basically a battle between fascists and Democrats in Spain, but Democrats dominated more and more by communists supported by Soviet Union. So for many people at that point, I'm a communist meant I'm against fascism. I support the good guys in Spain. I protect the Jews from persecution. And the movie again touches upon this, but I think it cuts them way too much slack, because you could believe this at some point in the 30s, but then the fact that in the 50s, once the Soviet Union had the nuclear bomb, people like Strauss were super suspicious towards people like Oppenheimer. I think the suspicion was also justified. So, but that's the thing with the movie. There's almost zero historical inaccuracy. So you cannot tell to Nolan, why did you, like, this is not accurate. But at the same time, the things that he pays attention to almost wants to switch your attention. Hey, forget this epic thing that we have here, which is the good side building a bomb that brought the end of the war faster and saved lives. And look at this thing, these weird conservatives who were anti-communist and they were spoiling, they were ruining people's reputation. So it's not that there's anything which is historical inaccuracy. It's mostly, where do you choose to focus? So that's the thing. From Nolan, I always, it's imagine like Batman having a diarrhea or something. Like, yeah, okay, technically you could have a diarrhea, but I expect the epic here. I don't expect like the trivial. And for me, the beef between between Oppenheimer and Strauss is not the big picture here. So that's why I want a bit more of the big picture.
Well, let me ask you, this might be too big of a question to unpack in the short time we have. So here's something I've wondered about, and I know you know a lot about this period of time. So, Ayn Rand said about her philosophy, she doesn't know she could have come up with it without the Industrial Revolution, right? Mm-hmm. Until you saw man's mind in action, it would have been impossible maybe to figure out everything she was able to figure out. And something I've wondered is, without the crimes of Stalin, and not just Stalin, I mean, there were atrocities that happened before Stalin and that were suppressed, right? There's the famous story about the New York Times, not reporting. So without seeing the record, right? The record of communism, the number of bodies, could even these really intelligent people, can you chalk it up to naivete, or do you think they should have known better? That's a brilliant
question. So if you're Oppenheimer and the year is 1938,
yes,
could you be excused from being curious, as he put it, towards communism? That's such...
To be sympathetic. Because think about it this way. I can put myself back in my shoes when I was 16, 17, 18, right? Didn't know any philosophy, was never taught history, right? We're not taught there's a great lecture I want to tell everyone to watch. It's by Alan Kors. It's called Socialism's Legacy. It's one of the most incredible it's a 1-hour talk, one of the most powerful talks he ever gives. One of the things he quotes in there.
Sorry, who's the guy?
Alan Kors, Dr. Alan Kors. I'll send the link. Maybe Daniel can put it in the chat after. It's one of Lisa showed to me. It's one of the most powerful lectures you'll ever watch. It's only an hour long. But one of the things he mentions in there is, if you asked most young people these days, how many people died at the hands of communism, they might say thousands. And he said, that's the equivalent of saying hundreds or dozens of people died in the Holocaust in terms of scale, right? The number of bodies that communism. So putting myself back into high school, I had no conception of how many people have been killed by this idea. And so it sounds like a very humane, I was taken by, I used to consider myself a socialist, but I was sympathetic towards it. I thought about ideas, but not very deeply. And it seemed like the more humane narrative that I was being told. And I did not have, it seems monstrous to me now to look back on it, because I now know the legacy of socialism. So that's the context for the question is, okay, back then, can you excuse them at all? How much how much was out there versus wasn't? They didn't have objectivism at the time. It's not like they were listening to lectures of objectivism and knew the philosophical issues. So that's the question I'll pose to you.
That's a brilliant and very difficult question. So to his credit, Oppenheimer says that when he saw the Molotov-Ribbentrop deal, so basically the approach between Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, then he started changing his mind. But that's what I'm saying, that Oppenheimer comes out at the end as a basically good person in history. But at the same time, the people who were very worried with the Soviet threat were also on the right, were definitely more on the right side of history, even more than Oppenheimer. Like Teller was more on the right side of history with his hydrogen bomb approach. Because, of course, today we know that the Soviets were already pursuing the hydrogen bomb before their first test of the actual. So the first bomb by the Soviets was the equivalent of the Nagasaki bomb. Why? Because they copied it. They had the secrets from their Los Alamos spies. But the Soviets were already working on the hydrogen bomb. So it's not that they developed the hydrogen bomb because the Americans developed the hydrogen bomb. So today we know that. So Strauss was on the right side of history. Teller was on the right side of history. At the same time, we can understand that Oppenheimer in the 30s, or at least until 39, he was under the impression, yeah, there might be something interesting here. It wasn't his job in terms of he wasn't like a historian. He wasn't. So the fact that he was at least potentially interested and misled, we can cut him some slack. Because later, he changes his mind, at least when it comes to the Communist Party. I wish he did the same when it comes to Soviet Union. So his idea that...
Well, here's an interesting example I wanted to share too of maybe demonstrating his naivete. One thing Oppenheimer really pushes is he thinks that we should share, and I don't fully understand his motivations for this, but a common theme in the book, and it's mentioned in the movie a few times, is he really believes what America should do is share the knowledge of the atomic bomb with the Russians. And to me, what that signals is he doesn't understand the nihilism of Stalin, of one of these dictators, right? I don't know if he fully appreciates that we're not talking about people who are doing socialism out of the goodness of their heart. We're talking about really, really evil, nihilistic people. But
well, that's the thing. So I have to go within a minute because from my Zoom I need to start an ARU class. So that's exactly what I say, that I stop my cutting of slack to Oppenheimer, that the idea that in the year 1945 or even after that, when you see that Soviet Union has actually occupied half of Europe with the force of the Red Army, and you still think we should share the secrets because this will somehow prevent the nuclear race, I think that's at best stupidity, because very often we see people who are brilliant in one area being very stupid in another area, or evasion. Anyway, I have no more than 20 seconds, so let me say a big thank you to Jonathan for your contribution and your super chat. Today, the reality show on Lucy Letby Update. Not very sure what this is, but I assume people will know. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. UK time, we have the History of Astronomy course with Joseph himself. And this is for Platinum and above ARC UK members. And tomorrow at 5 p.m., the Philosophy Forum talking about tattoos and high-risk sports. So I need within 10 seconds to start ARU class. Otherwise, I'll be in trouble with Yaron. Many thanks, Joseph. Many thanks to our viewers. And I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.